Welcome back again. In this video, we're going to talk about quantitative and qualitative research. These are two new types of research that we haven't talked about yet. These are two broad categories of research, so there are several different types of quantitative research and several different types of qualitative research. In this video, we'll go over a few different examples of quantitative and qualitative research. We'll also go into some of the types of qualitative research in a fair bit of detail. We'll go over the pros and cons of a few different types of qualitative research. But first, I want us to focus on the difference between quantitative research as a whole and qualitative research as a whole. I want us to understand the overall difference between quantitative and qualitative research before moving forward. So, the difference between quantitative and qualitative research just boils down to whether calculations are being performed and whether the results are numbers. In quantitative research, calculations are being performed and the results are numbers. In qualitative research, calculations are not being performed and the results are not numbers. In qualitative research, the results are something other than statistics. The results might be a set of notes in a notebook. The results might be a set of pictures that were taken. The results might be a video that was recorded in some type of a natural setting. Or the results might be artifacts that were uncovered in some type of setting. For example, a researcher might want to learn about behavior during an ancient time period by digging up artifacts. Those results would be qualitative research because the results are the artifacts, not numbers that have been calculated, not statistics. So when you think of quantitative research, imagine a researcher entering data values, bits of information into a spreadsheet and calculating statistics like means, standard deviations, or percentages, and creating some type of a figure or a table to display the results. When you think of qualitative research, imagine a researcher gathering detailed notes in a notebook, recording detailed verbal observations of behavior. I think that what I just told you is a good way to visualize or picture the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. What I told you is a little bit oversimplified, but I think that it really helps you see the difference in a kind of a concise way. So let's move forward. Now let's talk about the types of research that are considered quantitative in psychology and the types of research that are considered qualitative in psychology. In psychology, experimental research and survey research with closed questions are quantitative research. Those are two types of quantitative research, which means that in these two types of research, calculations are performed and the results are numbers. The results are statistics that are presented. Now, I need to explain what I mean by closed questions. In the next topic, in topic 4, when we're talking about survey research, we'll go over the difference between a closed question and an open-ended question. A closed question is a question that asks someone to choose from a fixed number of choices. So a multiple choice question would be closed. A Likert scale question on a 1 to 5 scale would be closed. A yes-no question would be closed. In each of those types of questions, the participant is choosing from a limited number of options. An open-ended question is a question that allows someone to freely express his or her thoughts, maybe under some constraints, but in general, an open-ended question allows a person to freely express their words in sentences or paragraphs. So think of an open-ended question as an essay question or a short answer question. So when a survey has closed questions, it's quantitative. When a survey has open-ended questions, it's actually qualitative. And before we move on, I want to explain what types of calculations are done in these two types of research, just so you can see why they're considered quantitative. So in an experiment, well, we've already covered this already, but I'll review this again. In an experiment, a researcher randomly assigns participants to conditions or situations and collects data from the participants, and then the researcher does calculations to arrive at a conclusion. Let's think about what calculations need to be done in an experiment before reaching a conclusion. So as a simple example, let's go back to that experiment with a hot room and a cold room. Imagine a researcher randomly assigns participants to two groups One group goes into a hot room and one group goes into a cold room, and both groups take the same recall test. And each person gets a recall score on the memory test. Think about what a researcher would have to do to find out whether the cold group outperformed the hot group. Well, a researcher would have to calculate two numbers to reach a conclusion. So the researcher would have to calculate the mean of the mean recall score, the average of the hot room, and the mean or average recall score of the cold room, and see which one is higher. Now, that actually wouldn't be the end of the calculations, because the researcher would have to run a significance test to find out if the means are significantly different. But overall, I just want you to understand that calculations are being done in an experiment before a conclusion is reached. Now, in a survey that has closed questions, the calculations that a researcher will do depends on what the research question is, what the researcher wants to know, and what types of questions are being asked. But I'll just share a couple of simple examples of calculations that could be done in a survey study. If a researcher is just asking a simple multiple choice question like, what's your major in college? Then the researcher might just calculate the percentage of people who chose each possible answer, and the results might end up being something like 30% psychology, 30% business, 20% engineering, 10% other, or something like that. And the researcher might create a pie chart to show those statistics. If a researcher is doing a study on personality, if a researcher is doing a study in which he or she is measuring personality traits, then the researcher might calculate correlations, which we'll talk about later in this class. The researcher might calculate values called correlation coefficients that will tell the researcher the relationships between the traits that were measured. So here's an example. Imagine a researcher has a hypothesis that people who are more extroverted or more outgoing tend to be lower in neuroticism or less anxious or, lower in neuroticism in general. So if a researcher had that hypothesis, then what a researcher would have to do is measure each person's extroversion in the participant sample and measure each person's neuroticism in the participant sample, and then take those data values and then calculate a correlation coefficient. And the correlation coefficient would answer the question for the researcher. And if the correlation coefficient comes out to a negative number, what that would tell the researcher is that those two variables, extroversion and neuroticism, have a negative correlation, which means that it's an inverse relationship, and the people who are higher in extroversion are tending to be lower in neuroticism. It's okay if you're not totally clear on correlation coefficients yet. So it's okay if you're not quite clear on what I mean by negative correlation, but we'll talk about that more in a later topic. I just want you to see what calculations are done in an experiment and in a survey with closed questions. And I want you to see why these two types of research are quantitative. And before we move forward, I wanted to point out a possible misunderstanding that I think students often have. So students often think, at least I think that they tend to think that in order for a study to be quantitative, the data has to be numerical. The data that's entered in the spreadsheet has to be numbers. And that's not actually true. The data values that are entered into the spreadsheet don't have to be numbers. They could be words or categories like male, female. For a study to be quantitative, the results, the final results that are calculated to reach a conclusion have to be numerical. So I'll share an example to help you understand what I mean. So imagine that a researcher wants to know if male students are more likely to live on campus at a certain university compared to female students. The researcher wants to know if male students tend to live on campus more often and female students less often. Well, the researcher would need to get a sample or a group of participants at the university to take a survey. Then the researcher would have to ask each person for gender and also, do you live on or off campus? And the researcher would get two answers from each person, the gender answer and the yes or no answer for living on campus. And notice how both of those answers are words. They're not numbers. For example, a person taking the survey might say male, yes, I live on campus. Another person might say female, no, I don't live on campus. So the data that's entered in the spreadsheet is all going to be words, categories, genders, and yeses and nos. But the researcher is going to calculate numbers to reach a conclusion. The researcher is going to calculate the percentage of the males that said, yes, I live on campus, and the percentage of the females who said, yes, I live on campus. And the two percentages are going to lead to a conclusion. So since the researcher is calculating those two percentages and the results are numerical, the study is quantitative. That's what I mean. So the values don't have to be numbers, the results have to be numbers for it to be quantitative. Okay, just wanted to point that out. And also, I wanted to mention that quantitative research is much more common in psychology compared to qualitative research. That's definitely a tradition in psychology. So if you go on PsycInfo and you look up different studies, you might never find a qualitative study. You might only find quantitative studies. So you might only see articles that report statistics in tables or figures. And I think that there might be a couple of reasons for this that I'll share, just some of my personal feelings. So one reason why quantitative research is much more common might be that psychologists often pride themselves in being highly scientific and rigorous. They want to believe that psychology is an actual real science, just like the hard sciences, like physics. So that might be part of it. It might be sort of a pride of being in the field of psychology. Also, it might be just something that's passed down from one generation to the next. So if one generation of professors does all quantitative research, they're going to teach the research methods that they know, which are quantitative, to their students, and they're going to do quantitative research, and then they're going to teach that to the next generation of students. So it might just be passed on like a tradition. Now, qualitative research is much more common in other social sciences like sociology or anthropology. They tend to do more studies in which they look for in-depth, detailed information rather than just statistics that go into a table. Actually, if you were a sociology major at your university, you would have to take 2 research methods classes. You would have to take one quantitative and one just for qualitative. That's because in that qualitative class, you would learn all of the details of qualitative research and how it's done in the field of sociology. But since you're a psychology major and qualitative research is much less common, we're just going to talk about qualitative research briefly before we move into quantitative research, which is what's typically done in psychology. Okay. So in the next part of this video, we'll talk about a few specific types of qualitative research, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of each type of qualitative research.